what is it that you're trying to work towards, okay, is the best kind of recipe for success, and it just isn't. Come across the Liver King, who's very popular on social media at the moment. Right guys, so welcome back to another episode of the Q&A. We know how it works by now, so I'm just going to go straight into it. Again, got some pretty meaty questions, so there's a lot of different topics I'm going to be covering today. And as always, just drop any other questions that you do have in the comments below. So first question, should you split your training consistently for upper and lower body parts, or should you dedicate more time to one than the other? Okay, now there's three things that you need to ask yourself to kind of establish your individual setup, because obviously we know that training is different for different people. First one is creating the clarity of the outcome measure, which is just a geeky way of saying, what is it that you're trying to work towards, okay? Do you have a bias towards one muscle group than the other? Do you have a bias towards one lift more than the other? In which case, you're going to want to spend a little bit more of your, which is the second point, training resources that you have available. If you imagine it as like a currency and you have a finite amount, and finances are actually one of the things that you could consider with this, there is only a certain amount of your resources that you can commit to one particular goal, okay? And people often make this mistake, particularly if you're the type of person that can spend a lot of time in the gym, of thinking that more is always better. And in some scenarios it is, but it can go too far the other way. And one of those other resources you have to consider is things like your energy management and your recoverability. As you'll see when we talk about another question later on, a lot of people confuse like exertion with intensity. They think, particularly in this whole world that we live in of like get up and grind and put the effort in, they think that, you know, pushing to failure on every single movement or adding in more exercises, more volume, more of everything is the best kind of recipe for success, and it just isn't. It's really difficult because you might know people that train like that or seem to train like that, you know, they're dripping in sweat and going crazy all the time, but there will be a deficit somewhere else in their life in terms of the resources that they can commit to that variable, you know, and that's just something you have to bear in mind. People that work a really high stress job, okay, and they can only commit 3 hours of training, not only physically, but mentally, don't have the same kind of currency available to someone who can train every single day. So that's the kind of second question you have to check. And then the third and final thing that I would recommend is to get a performance measure or an outcome measure that can directly tell you whether or not your plan is actually working, okay? This is the biggest mistake I see with people that have a focus on aesthetics and whatnot, is first of all, they rely too heavily on the actual aesthetic, and that's so heavily influenced by fatigue management, mood state, dehydration, sodium, and you know, all these different variables that will determine how you look on a given day, that it can be a very bumpy road when it comes to understanding whether or not you're actually progressing. You see this a lot with guys that are bulking and cutting and everything, and then there's all these memes where they're kind of stuck between wanting to be absolutely swole and bulk but becoming fat, and then wanting to be shredded but becoming thin. It has such a massive range of what you think is actually working that people often lose sight of what it is that we're working towards in the first place. So having a performance measure is a really, really good thing to have, even if your goal isn't necessarily to become better at that movement. Really simple one might be how many pull-ups you can do per week, okay? You could set like a total volume goal, or you could set one test day. You know, every Wednesday you go in, you do as many pull-ups as you can on one set. If that number is continuing to climb, you know you're getting stronger, which means you know the plan that you're actually working on is working. If, however, it continues to go down, it's not. You know what I mean? You're pushing a little bit too hard and you need to back off. So that's kind of the three questions I would get you to check first on an individual level. In terms of direct training recommendations, okay, the upper body will recover much faster than the lower body for the 90% of the people watching this video, okay? Now, we've got to take into account things like absolute load. If you're the type of person that can bench more than you can squat, then no. Upper body will probably take just as long, if not a little bit longer, to recover because the absolute load is heavier. But most people can't do that. You've got to take into account that the cross-sectional area of a muscle or the size of a muscle usually means, as we've seen in research and just anecdotally, that it can inflict more damage to itself. Whether that's through mechanical tension, muscle damage, it doesn't matter. The point is it will take a little bit longer to recover. So people with huge quads tend to have a harder time recovering from the overload work that they've done on their quads. And in the upper body, particularly in women, well, it's kind of two variables as to why women tend to recover, we think anyway. One is that there's a larger amount of capillarization, which means there's more blood flow on like a really kind of histological level to muscle tissue, but also muscle mass, or the starting point of muscle mass, tends to be a little bit lower. The overall relative improvements can be exactly the same as it can be in men. Because the absolute level of the muscle tends to be smaller, it means that it can recover a lot quicker, the volume can be a lot higher. So again, if you understand that, you can start to look into direct muscle groups themselves. The biceps do not need a full day to be trained. But conversely, they can recover fairly quickly. And this is the final thing to consider, is there is a point of diminishing returns within one training session. And again, going back to the amount of damage that you can inflict with a certain muscle. So what I mean by that is 10 sets of 10 in one training session is not the same as 5 sets of 10 spread across 2 training sessions, okay? Now, 10 sets of 10 is probably not the best example because German volume training, there's a fair amount of research on it, but you get what I mean, that you could say, right, well, I'm going to do my whole leg day, the whole weekly training volume on one day, and then that's it, my legs are done. But the reality of it is your intensity is naturally going to be a little bit lower towards the back end of that session. Your exercise execution, even if you manage to keep the weight the same, your coordination within the movement, something is going to give that will reduce the stimulus to that muscle that would actually be better placed in another training session. And again, that volume bracket tends to actually be a little bit smaller within the lower body stuff. You can get away with absolutely smashing your delts and then continuing to overload them throughout the rest of the session. Doesn't really work that well in your quads. And the final thing I would suggest with that one is understanding that you don't have to necessarily only train one area of the body at any one time, okay? You can dedicate an emphasis to it and do what we call like top up volume within the back end of that training session. So you might do an upper lower split, okay? You might run that, say you train 6 days a week, to give an example, you might run upper lower, it's like a tongue tied then. But within each of those lower body sessions, you might actually top up with a little bit of upper body work on an area that you want to work on. So you might do upper body primarily as a key focus and then work on calves at the back end of that session. Then in your lower body session, you might do primarily your lower body and then work on your triceps at the back end of that session. You can, or at the start, it doesn't always have to be at the end, but the point is you can sprinkle in the smaller muscle groups that need more frequent stimulus because they recover quicker throughout the whole training week, okay? So I hope that makes sense. That's probably quite a generalized question to program design overall. So if people are interested in me doing a more kind of in-depth view on that, then that's absolutely fine. Just drop me a comment below. And to add to that, if you want me to go through your individual case anymore, then obviously just drop me a message on social media and I'll do everything I can to help. Okay, so next question. Calorie intake has increased, but body weight has dropped, okay? Now this is actually one of my favorite talking points with nutrition. So I'll try and keep it nice and concise, I promise. And chances are if you're watching this and you know what BMR is, you will usually explain this by saying it's the amount of calories that your body needs to take in to be able to maintain its current body weight. And for some reason, everyone seems to fixate on body weight as the key variable for overall health, even though it's only one metric. What it should be more accurately determined to be is the amount of calories that your body needs to maintain optimal healthy function. Just think about it logically. If you are ill, but everything else was the same, so you were still training, you were still working, everything like that, technically you would need to have a slightly higher calorie intake to be able to fight that infection, okay? Think about it when women are pregnant. They usually eat more food because they have to facilitate the growth of another human being. It's not just down to body weight, okay? And I know that's a really weird example, but like I said, people tend to obsess so much over body weight, it causes a little bit of confusion. So with that in mind, okay, we want to talk about something called homeostasis and allostasis. Now, homeostasis, most people know to be the regulatory function within the human body, okay? So we have these systems in place that are supposed to be maintained at set points, yeah? A classic example is the body temperature. You know, if you get cold, you shiver. If you get warm, you sweat. It's supposed to maintain this optimal level. However, there's other things in the human body that aren't homeostatic. They're what's known as allostatic, which is where we have a set point, but it moves in response to chronic stress. And BMR is a classic example of that. Alongside, so is strength, okay? Really simple example for you here. There's something known as midnight strength or base strength, which is essentially if you were to roll out, that's why it's called midnight, if you were to roll out of bed in the middle of the night and immediately have to perform a task, whatever that level of strength is with no priming, nothing like that, no warming up, no 40 minutes of mobility, that is your baseline strength. That does shift over time. Someone who's got a 400 kilogram deadlift is obviously going to have a higher baseline level of strength than the average person. So it's this kind of allostatic point that does move, and BMR is another one of those, okay? And what we see, because people get so caught up with the body weight side of things, is they actually focus primarily on right, well, whatever calories I'm taking in at the moment, that must be my metabolic rate because I'm maintaining where my body function is. But they don't realize that there will be something, it depends upon that individual person, but there will be something that is suffering as a result, okay? Now, this isn't identifying or assessing you as an individual. This is just saying that if we were to kind of line up all markers of health, whether it's stress management, whether it's mental health, anxiety, pain management, connective tissue, like integrity in general, because that's been shown to be linked to it, whether it was muscle mass, strength, anything like that, there will be something along this kind of spectrum that suffers, okay, as a result of there being this chronic under-eating or this chronic reduction in calorie intake, or this discrepancy between what your BMR should be for healthy function and what you think your BMR is for maintaining your body weight, okay? So a classic example with that is pain management. There's a lot of literature to show that malnutrition is one of the key variables when it comes to chronic pain. People just aren't eating enough, and they're not eating the right food composition to give them the micronutrients they need to be able to suppress or reduce their pain levels. So one of the easy ways to actually reduce chronic pain is to just eat more food. I know it's really weird, and I'm not saying that, just to kind of, as a disclaimer, I'm not saying that is the case for everyone, because a lot of people, you know, they have pain alongside other comorbidities like obesity, but it is actually a variable a lot of people don't realize is linked, okay? So if we understand that allostasis is this adjustment in set point, okay, in response to chronic stress, if you then combine that with being a type of person that is very disciplined, very motivated, and will override how they feel to be able to complete a task, it's a recipe for exaggerating this discrepancy between those two variables, if that makes sense. A lot of people, again, like I talked about before, can get confused between how hard they think they're working and how hard they can objectively work, okay? If you come in and you pride yourself on the grind and you pride yourself on being able to work as hard as possible, that's brilliant. And that is something that should be preserved and something that should be encouraged. However, it's that whole line that we tend to say of there's a difference between being productive and being busy. If something isn't progressing you forward in whatever metric you're trying to work towards, categorically it's not effective, or it's not as effective as if you were to adjust a few things. So what you'll actually see when you increase your calorie intake is your training intensity will primarily go up. Now, I'm not going to talk about the biochemistry when it comes to the increase in thermogenic effects or anything like that. What I'm fixating on today is this idea that when your calorie intake increases, your body says, oh, surprise, I have this abundance of energy. I'm taking care of all of these functions that need to be maintained day to day. I have this abundance left over for training. Oh, surprise, I can do an extra 2 pull-ups. I can do an extra 5 kilos on the squat. Whatever it is, the point is your training intensity will increase. And that's what leads you into this positive feedback loop there, where you'll have this kind of momentary lag, okay, where your training intensity will increase, but this allostatic point of your basal metabolic rate doesn't actually increase with it just yet. So you tend to get a momentary dip in body weight, okay? And then what happens is your body says, oh shit, I need to move up a little bit. That's where my metabolic rate actually is for maintaining just weight. I can bump it up to there, then it will stabilize again, then you can increase your calories again, and it will continue to kind of feed forward like that. So a lot of the time, because people think that calorie deficits are the only way to lose weight, it is usually the only way, but if you're thinking about long-term adaptation, you can actually have a slight increase in calorie intake that will initially bring your body weight down and to a more stable level so that you can optimize your function rather than just thinking that body weight is the only metric in mind. So I hope that makes sense. Again, I could talk about this all day, this allostasis, but if you want me to go through it in a little bit more detail, please do just drop me a message. But for now, that's all I'm going to go through. Now, next question is how important is direct mobility work? Okay, so there's 3 things you need to ask yourself for this one. Number 1, how far away from the ideal are you? Okay, is anybody watching this now come across the Liver King, who's very popular on social media at the moment? Removing my personal opinion from him, I actually like what he's got to say, but from his kind of quote idyllic view of the fact that the human body should be fairly primal, we should be outside, you know, there's other things that we should be doing rather than sitting at a desk. There's a little bit of truth to that in the sense of we know, all like deep down, we know what the ideal human body should be doing. It should be moving, it should be squatting regularly, it should be playing, it should be exploring, climbing trees, hunting animals, all that crap that you want to talk about, whatever it is. Everyone thinks it's all this wishy-washy crap, but in reality, it's what our human bodies have evolved to be able to deal with, okay? And we see this, we talk about it all the time, you know, the fact that kids can sit in the bottom of a squat and have absolutely no problem whatsoever. And then if I asked you to do that, how soon would it be that your knees are aching? So a lot of these movement experts all over social media, they latch onto that and say, you should spend 10 minutes a day sat down in the squat position. And it's like, fuck off, that's not gonna happen. Like, we're not gonna do that. In reality, what we need to find is how far away from the ideal are we? If we've had an ACL rupture, we spend 12 hours a day sat down, we eat a load of shit that isn't good for our joints or whatever it is, and we're chronically dehydrated, mobility work is probably going to be quite an essential part of your training program, particularly in the early stages, to be able to achieve the movements that you want to achieve to then create overload, okay? If, however, you're the type of person that spends the majority of his day on his feet, you drink a lot of water, you take, quote, joint supplements, which is something I could talk about in a separate video, but you take joint supplements day to day, when you do train, you can perform sufficient range of motion with no real issues, then you probably don't need to spend 40 minutes a day foam rolling, okay? It all comes down to that first question of how far away from the ideal are you? And again, if you want specific recommendations for that, I can do a separate video, but just as a general question, leads into the next thing is what tools are you using, okay? People don't realize, but you can band resistances into three main categories: fixed, fluid, and body weight, okay? Now this is an old Soviet categorization, but a lot of people look at it as machines, free weights, compound isolation. But just even before we go into that, first of all, machines aren't the only form of fixed resistance. What we do to classify it is fixed resistances are a setting where you have to mold your body position to fit the resistance in question, okay? So a machine only moves one way. You have to adjust your body to allow the machine to move. But a barbell technically falls into that category with certain movements. Think about when you do a bench press, okay? Your arms are in a, quote, pronated position, which cues a little bit more internal rotation at the shoulder. When you do a squat, you have to have a certain amount of external rotation to get the bar on your back. When you do a deadlift, me and one of my training partners, like I said in another video, he's 6'6", but the bar is at the same height as it is for me. So it's a little bit further away from him than it is for me. So he needs to do a little bit more mobility work. A fluid resistance, on the other hand, is what we'd classify as a variable that can, what we classify as a load that can mold around your body shape or body type. Dumbbells, kettlebells, resistance bands, those types of things. It's the reason why they tend to go into a separate category. Now, between the two, fixed resistances tend to provide more overload. You can push more output in those, which is why people tend to bias them. However, it comes with a slightly higher mobility and stability demand. On the flip side, fluid resistances tend to be easier, more, quote, friendly, which is why a lot of people gravitate towards kettlebell work later on in their training careers. You might not have noticed this, but anyone that you follow, they will grade themselves. They'll go from barbells, squats, everything like that, and then they'll all of a sudden say, I found kettlebells, I did the Turkish get-up, I did windmills and kettlebell swings, and they're so much better than barbells. They're not, they're just more suited to you as a person now. And then finally, you have the body weight resistance, and we know that body weight resistance brings its own host of benefits, but with very little overload. So that's another variable you have to consider. If you're using a lot of fixed resistances, mobility work is always going to be of greater importance. And then the final thing is, what is your parasympathetic tone? I've spoken about this before. Are you the type of person that is tightly strung, not sleeping very well because of stress with work, exposed to a high level of stress day to day anyway, and then don't give yourself any time to, quote, unwind? Again, it sounds wishy-washy, but it's very important because it ultimately determines what your resting muscular tone is. Look at something like sleep quality. If you don't sleep very well and you don't go through a lot of REM cycles, then again, chances are your body isn't resetting that parasympathetic tone, so you're going to have a higher amount of resting tension. If you started taking any anabolics or androgens or anything like that, they tend to increase sympathetic tone, so that will naturally bring with it a higher level of muscular tension that needs to be taken care of with mobility work. So they're the three variables I would get you to consider with that. And then the final question, if there was one bit of advice I could give someone starting training, okay, what would it be? I'm not going to give one, I'm going to give three, obviously, because I will always talk too much. The first one, from a philosophical standpoint, okay, of how you should approach it, in my opinion, is to be open-minded, or as open-minded as you can be, and learn, okay? A lot of people on social media nowadays are getting a lot of traction and a lot of growth of their brand by kind of condemning other people and going through this focus of like rants or slagging off other practitioners or something like that, and it's great in some ways because it gives people this kind of community belonging that they have. But have you not noticed how weird and kind of toxic that is, that you are belonging to something based on your collective dislikes to someone else? I'm more of a fan of the idea of uplifting other people. I know it sounds all overly optimistic, but I personally think that you should go into it with this idea of, you know what, those people that do Zumba over there, you do you crack on. Other people over here that want to lift weights and slap each other and sniff ammonia all day, you crack on, rather than thinking that there's something wrong with either method. So that would be my first thing, is be open-minded and learn, because if this is something that's new to you, you don't know what you suit. When I first started training, I used to fight. I was a boxer, and I thought that was my absolute passion. I thought that nothing would come even close to the love that I had for that sport. I met a lot of people in it, and it was my absolute, like, I would spend more time training then than I did now. But it's flipped and I was exposed to strongman, and now strongman's my main love. So it just depends on the person. From a standpoint of the physical side of things, like with what the human body can do, and direct recommendations for training, there's two things with this one. Number one, learn the concept of what tension actually is, like true volitional tension, the ability to switch a muscle on. It feeds into everything. It feeds into mind-muscle connection with your lifting, like with the bodybuilding side of things, but it also feeds into safety and effectiveness with a lot of the compound movements that you perform. The ability to switch on a muscle, I know it sounds really weird, but most movements that you'll have done, particularly at an early age, you won't have been exposed to that. They're movements that are either autonomic in nature, you just run, you don't think about what you do with your foot, or they're centered around skill and fluidity. When we come into this, quote, static world where you start to lift things, you have to switch things on and be able to stabilize them. And that kind of leads into the final thing that I would recommend, which is there's no gold standard, okay? But it takes quite a while to build intuition. So I've actually gone back and forth with this over the years, and I used to say to people, you need to do exactly what works for you, find what works for you. I'm 12 years in, well, yeah, I'm over 12 years into this kind of lifting strength game and whatnot. I still don't know what works for me. And even worse still, every 6 months, a new thing works better than the old thing. So that's something that changes over time. And a lot of people give advice and say, find exactly what works for you. But if you don't know what works for you, that can be quite overwhelming. So I would actually say that, you know, success leaves clues, and there's a reason why these programs like 5-3-1, starting strength 5x5, whatever it is, why they've stood the test of time, because they are very general. They expose you to these general movement patterns that are fairly simple in nature, at least when you start, and they give you an exposure to the world without making them overly complicated. So guys, that's the Q&A for today. Again, if you did find any value in this video, it would be a huge help if you could just leave a like and especially a comment below. It just helps with the algorithm. Everyone says it now at the end of the video, but it would be a huge help, so I would appreciate that. Again, if you have any questions, please just drop them either in the comments below or send me a message directly, and I'll feature them in the next video, or I'll just get back to you personally. As always, stay strong, and I'll see you on the next one.